Prior to October 7th, Egypt and Israel were at peace. Egypt was the first Arab country to sign a peace treaty with Israel back in 1979, 6 years after what became known as the Yom Kippur War. It was never a warm peace, but it appeared durable because it provided tangible benefits to both countries. And it was widely believed that Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi despised the Muslim Brotherhood. He had, after all, led the Egyptian military's 2013 overthrow of then Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi, a leader of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood. Hamas is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. Over recent months, however, Egypt's behavior has been puzzling and distressing, to say the least. We're going to talk about what's going on between Cairo and Jerusalem with Haisam Hassanein, who holds a master's degree in Middle Eastern and African history from Tel Aviv University. He was the first Egyptian ever to be named a graduate school valedictorian by an Israeli academic institution. He's also an alumnus of FDD's National Security Fellowship Program, and he's now an adjunct fellow at FDD. Haisam speaks Arabic and Hebrew. Also with us is Jonathan Schanzer, FDD's Senior Vice President for Research. John earned his PhD from King's College London. John speaks Hebrew and Arabic. They're with me, Cliff May, and with you on this listener-supported program. We'll be speaking with them, mostly in English, here on Foreign Policy. Well, welcome, Haisam, and welcome, Jonathan. Haisam, I think this is your first time on Foreign Policy, so to get to know you better, how did it evolve that you went to university in Tel Aviv? Did you go for the waters, or were you under the impression the hummus was better there?
So basically, I was doing my undergrad here in the United States, and I was studying about Middle East politics, and it happened that I met many students come from Jewish American background for the first time in my life. Because, as you know, in Egypt, we don't see Jews. And what surprised me at the time was many of them study about Arabic, study about Islam, which both is my language and my religion. And I was fascinated because many of the students used to share with me that the Jewish American students, they lived in Morocco for a few times, they lived in Egypt, they lived in different countries in the Arab world. And for me as a young student, I was shocked and I was surprised. All what I know about them is they are the other or the opposite, And I felt a little bit jealous, and I said, you know what, if they come to our land and study about our religion and culture and know who we are, why don't I do the opposite? And I go study in Israel to see who are the Jews, what is the Hebrew language look like, and what is this country, Israel, look like. So I decided to apply at Tel Aviv University, and they were kind enough to accept me, and I have gone through an amazing experience in my lifetime.
What was the response in Egypt among people you knew there, or among the government, that you were going to go study in Tel Aviv?
So when I made the decision to go and study there, it was a secret deal between me and my mom and my brothers. Because in our Arab American community, it's frowned upon. And back home in Egypt, it's looked as the enemy. So literally, I was living and studying in Israel for almost like a year or 2 years, and nobody heard about that. Nobody knows where I was except my mom and my siblings. And all of a sudden, in my graduation, I gave the valedictorian speech. It was widely received in Israel, was picked up in Arab media. Al Jazeera actually broadcasted some segments of it. Egyptian television, owned by the Egyptian intelligence, broadcasted the whole speech. And it was, in our culture, let's put it this way, a big scandal, So everybody all of a sudden knows about your sick. And I still remember one of my classmates from high school in Egypt. He was going to his college in Cairo, and he was passing by a kiosk on the street, and he saw my picture on one of the newspapers. And it says, an Egyptian treason in the heart of Tel Aviv. So he took the picture and he sent it to me right away. And since then, we never talked again, because he doesn't want to respond or anything because he's scared of the whole thing. But it was a crazy, but also it made me as a person grow up a lot, because at the time I was 23, 24, and I just went to a country, I liked it, and I shared that with my friends, but and my classmates. All of a sudden, it becomes like a big thing in Egypt and in the Arab world. And since then, I made it's a personal mission to write more, discuss more, and find ways to solve the issues between people to people, and how can we pressure governments in Egypt or in the Arab world to adjust the narratives in order to avoid the unnecessary demonizing of the other side just simply because they are different in religion or at some point in the history of the region there was conflict. At the end of the day, Jews look like us, and I was fascinated that many of them come from Middle Eastern background, and this is still fascinates me until today. And just people, and I think this has to change at some point. And after the Gaza crisis, by the way, I'm more motivated to contribute to the discourse and enhance such closeness between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East, because really all of this is unnecessary. As somebody who lived there, all of this is unnecessary. Really, they could get along.
And just you spoke, when you went to Israel, you spoke, I would imagine, English at that point, but not Hebrew. Is that right?
Yes. Let's put it this way. When I was living in Israel, my time was at the beginning was divided between two different communities. The first community received me in Israel was the Olim community. Americans, Canadians, Anglo-Saxon Jews who made Aliyah, because I was studying with them. I was around them all the time. So you can imagine, even when I went to Ulpan, I was studying with some Ukrainians, some Russians, some Brazilians, and they didn't know English.
And Ulpan is where people go to learn Hebrew, just so people listen to. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Exactly. So I was living so the only way for me to communicate with Jews who don't speak English or made Aliyah was that we had to learn Hebrew by order. And the second community that I started to open up to was the Arab Israeli community, because they speak Arabic. They were excited to know you. And then they were the ones who started to introduce me to the Jewish Israeli Sabra side, and then this is how you start to be integrated more and more between three different communities: Olim community, Arab Israeli community, and the Sabra community.
And Israeli Arabs, they treated you well. They were glad to see you. They were friendly. What was their attitude?
It depended on who you talked to. At the beginning, they were skeptical because it was very, very uncommon. Remember, we were students and we were 23, 24, so we were not rational.
Yeah.
So many of them were a little bit scared who you are, how dare you. They understand how hostile the Egyptian culture to Israel in general. So the fact that all of a sudden you leave all this education and mentality and all what you have been taught and you come to this land was very maneuvering and surprising for them. And others also talk it from a very political perspective. It will be funny if I tell you the first time to hear about BDS was not in America. It was in Tel Aviv University, because I was sitting with this Arab Israeli student who likes President Nasser, and he introduced me to the concept of BDS. And they had pictures of Nasser everywhere in their dormitories, and it was an interesting time, But overall, it was amazing time. And by the way, also there was a big present. Let's put it this way: my first day at Tel Aviv University, the first people I talked to in the university with the Muslim Brotherhood Student Association inside Israel, inside Tel Aviv University, because I lived across the campus. I crossed the street before you enter the university. It was a table of all big beard Muslim Brotherhood students. So I approached them. We talked. They got my email and they started to inviting me, to their prayers at Tel Aviv University, go to Al-Aqsa Mosque and all these things. So it was very interesting encounter with the Arab Israeli students at Tel Aviv University.
The whole story of Israeli Arabs, very interesting. We're not going to get into it today, but it's fascinating in many ways. Let's do the news for today. We're recording on Tuesday. Full disclosure, there was on Monday an exchange of gunfire between Israeli and Egyptian soldiers near the Rafah border crossing. John, what else do we know about this?
Well, as far as we know, it was initiated by a soldier on the Egyptian side. The Israelis returned fire. The Israeli soldiers actually killed an Egyptian soldier. Since then, both sides have called it an incident. They're not calling it an escalation. They're not describing it as anything more than, something that was unfortunate and that they don't want to have turn into an international incident. But it comes amidst the backdrop of a lot of other tension that we've been observing between Cairo and Jerusalem, namely that the Egyptians have at different points shut down the crossing that has been providing humanitarian assistance into Gaza. They have been warning the Israelis not to enter Rafah, the southernmost town on the border of the Sinai Peninsula, where Hamas has the bulk of its remaining brigades intact. And when the Israelis have gone in, it has elicited howls of disapproval from Cairo. The government in Egypt has been warning that that could be a red line and that it could actually mean the end of the Abraham Accords. We've never quite seen tension at this level between Israel and Egypt in the Camp David Accords era. So this is something new and deeply troubling, and certainly something that we've been watching here closely at FPD.
And don't we know the following, that for years the conventional wisdom analysis, the conceptia, as the Israelis might say, had been that the border between Gaza and Egypt, the Philadelphia corridor, that there had been tunnels for smuggling underneath it, but the government was taking care of that. They were flooding those tunnels. They weren't going to let it happen because they don't like Hamas. They have a relationship with Israel that's important. And now we know, I think, that there are no less than 50 tunnels under that Rafah border, under the Philadelphia corridor. And what's more, I think we certainly strongly suspect that the huge arsenal of weapons that Hamas has, they're still firing rockets to this day. They have ammunition. I mean, think of all they have. The Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, Hamas not. That it came under that border, and that Sisi must have known about that. Am I wrong on this? Go, both of you can. I guess, John, you're nodding your head. You start, and then Haisam,
let's just say this: that Sisi came to power in 2014. And that in the immediate aftermath of him coming to power, it appeared that the government in Cairo was determined to dismantle all elements of the Muslim Brotherhood inside the country. And so that would include the tunnels that were supplying Hamas with weaponry. And certainly from the 2012 conflict, I think there was a lot of evidence suggesting that the Morsi regime, the Muslim Brotherhood regime, had been working hand in glove with Hamas, and then so it looked as if for maybe 3 or 4 years the Sisi regime was really determined to dismantle those tunnels, and we heard stories about how they were being flooded in some cases with sewage water, making the tunnels inoperable. The understanding that I have now is that somewhere around 2018, which was, by the way, the same year that most people indicate that the Qataris started bringing money into the Gaza Strip as well, that something gave back then, that there was a decision undertaken by the Sisi regime to allow those tunnels to operate. And then somewhere beyond that, and I don't think anybody has a hard and fast timeline here, but that they began to actually build out more tunnels, that there's more underground infrastructure. Some sources that I've talked to in the Middle East are talking about a highway system, large tunnels that would enable the regime or Hamas to bring in fully intact weapon systems rather than the parts that were used previously to build the rockets and the weapons, that they were actually coming through completely intact. There are reports of potential tunnels that connect directly to the Rafah airport that would mean that they're actually dropping these weapons directly underground as they land from places like Iran or from Libya or from wherever they may come from. None of this has been confirmed officially by the Israeli government. They're not saying this directly. I think there is concern about what cost there would be to Israel by exposing this. The regime in Cairo will not acknowledge any of this. Even if they're caught with their pants down, if they're caught red-handed, they will not cede that they've done this unless the Israelis begin to, broadcast photos or video of what they've found. But that would probably mean the end of the peace agreement. And, there's a saying in the Middle East, and that is, as Egypt goes, so goes the rest of the Middle East. Now, that was something that used to be said when Cairo was the capital of the Arab world. It's no longer the capital of the Arab world. I think we can now safely say that it's Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates rather than, Cairo and Damascus, it used to be the political center of gravity. But the big question right now that I have is why? If this is the case, and we think there's a pretty good chance that it's true, what was it that convinced the regime to do this? Was it ideological? Was it, a deliberate attempt to undermine Israeli security over time? Or was it that they were in dire straits financially, which we know they have been, right? That they've lost a lot of money over the years since the revolution and the counter-revolution. There's just no tourism. And by the way, it's even worse. The Suez Canal is I think operating at 50% capacity since this war began. But it wasn't great before then. Economically, things were in dire straits there. So was it a financial decision? Was it an ideological decision? What's going on here? And, wither the future of Egypt-Israeli relations. What's happening here right now?
I'm going to throw it back to you, Haisam, but fold this into it, because it doesn't necessarily need to be monocausal, right? There can be several things. There can be the money made from smuggling. The Israeli commentator Caroline Glick notes that el-Sisi's son, General Mahmoud el-Sisi, serves as deputy commander of Egypt's General Intelligence Directorate, and he founded a group that has subsidiaries that controls all aspects, she says, of the border crossing with Egypt. So he may have profited from this. It also strikes me as least possible that Hamas says to the Egyptians, look, here's the deal. You help us fighting Israel, and we'll lay off you. There'll be no more Mohammed Morsi's. We're not going to. We'll have a separate peace between us, but we need certain help with you against Israel, and we'll keep it quiet, at least for now. Anyhow, I know I'm asking you to be speculative, Haisam, but give us your thoughts.
Let me start by saying, let me address the John Why and being speculative about John Why as well. One way to explain this is that some of the officials from the Egyptian side were corrupt ones who benefited financially from deals with Gaza by a way or another. Their government knew about it, but didn't do anything to balance its relations with Hamas, who were leaning toward Turkey and Qatar. So in order for Cairo to create an equilibrium, they had to look the other way while Hamas dug tunnels and smuggled weapons. Another point I would argue also, the regime entered an alliance with tribal leaders from Sinai during its fight against terrorism in Sinai. And those tribal leaders got richer through business deals with the military and security establishment.
And these tribal leaders are Bedouins in Sinai. Am I understanding correctly?
Exactly.
Basically, yeah.
Yes. And part of this money were used by these new, let's call it this way, new emerged business leaders to buy influence with tribes throughout Sinai to cement their local grip on the poor population there and compensate them for the lack of services offered by the Egyptian government. As you can understand, part of the lucrative income that came to their pockets were from business deals with Gaza. And this makes me assess, as Israel nowadays gets closer to Rafah, the regime starts to get more and more nervous because his domestic constituencies, the ones I refer to as business leaders on the opposite side of the border, want to hear such a discourse from the government that is defending their interests. And this explains why the Egyptian regime nowadays is even more hysterical, because also not even he entered the deal with Hamas, but also he has business constituents inside the Egyptian side of the borders who really want the regime to defend the business deals they have been doing for the past 5-6 years with Hamas.
Is it also credible to you that the Egyptian government may have said to some of these Bedouin tribal leaders, look, we're going to help you make some money through this, but that's also meant as a way to they're competing with ISIS cells in Sinai who have been trying to, tell me if I'm wrong, recruit some of these Bedouin tribes for ISIS. And so if you're trying to compete, one way you do it is say, look, we can enrich you better than they can. Don't work with ISIS. Stay loyal to the government, but we'll help you make money on smuggling.
This part of it, but also another part of this issue at the time was tribe leaders, when they knew they had sons work for ISIS, they didn't share that with the Egyptian government at the time. And this was a big issue, and they opened the door for them to hide among them. So the deal was that to start doing deals with leaders over there who have more loyal supporters on the ground, and then they started to share the information. So it was about how to get and extract information from them on the ground. And obviously money was a way to buy them.
Go ahead, John. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just say this, that we're not saying the quiet part out loud here, which I think is important to just say. that if this is the case, that the Egyptians were allowing for these large tunnel structures to operate and that they were doing so for the last 6 years, that means that the Egyptians they were complicit with the Hamas terrorist organization, not just in the rearming of the group, but also that it was these tunnels that likely enabled Hamas fighters to go out of the territory to train and to prepare themselves for the 10/7 attack. And so, in other words, this is a real potential moment of crisis that may be brewing here. That if the Israelis can show with some certainty that this happened, what do they do? If you don't want to disrupt the peace agreement that you've had for many years that served you well since the late 1970s, but you have major concerns about this regime in Cairo and what they've been doing, what is the right way forward? And maybe one other thing that is important to just ask, and I don't know how to answer it, is this something that is known to the Biden administration? And if so, does that explain in part why they've been so adamantly opposed to Israel operating in Rafah, right? They've been talking about, first it was don't go in because Ramadan, right? And then it was don't go in because, you got 1.4 million people. And then you got don't go in because of the ICJ and the warnings that they're hearing. But what if it actually was, hey, don't go in because you're going to, if this all comes to light, will this single-handedly bring down the U.S.-led structure in the Middle East? Right. This is the cornerstone of the U.S.-led order in the region. That everything has been built since 1979. It's been based on this quiet, and that's been the way that we've built out some of the other structures across the Middle East. And so, if this begins to collapse, that is a collapse of American foreign policy, and that's not something, obviously, that the Biden administration would like to see. But so there's a lot going on here that we still have not learned about. There's a lot of information that we're still missing, but I think we're beginning to fill in those blanks, and it's not a pretty picture.
And there's no way, it seems to me, that the Israelis can finish the job they're doing in Rafah and not stop up those 50 miles of tunnels, which is not an easy thing to do. It's not as simple, it turns out, as pouring sewage or seawater into them. It's much harder, but they'll have to do it. The Egyptians don't want them to do that, not least because it makes clear what's been going on. The Israelis probably don't want to break in relations with the Egyptians at this point, at least, so they will maybe continue to talk about incidents. Go ahead, Haisam. You have some thoughts on this.
Yes, two things also I want to share. Regarding the CNN report that mentioned the Egyptian intelligence guy who tried to trick the Israelis by submitting a different deal. Interestingly, on social media, there have been pictures circulated for him in the past few years, traveling to Gaza, meeting with Sinwar, and even attending a Shaheed conference or celebration inside the Gaza Strip. And I think for those who leaked these kind of pictures, they are trying to insinuate by a way or another, this guy was more sympathetic with Hamas. Another thing is worth mentioning is recently, and as I mentioned, there are business constituents within the Sinai tribal leaders who benefited from the smuggling business, and this is why the Sisi regime is trying to defend their interests nowadays. Recently, the Qataris sent a delegation to visit them and meet with them in Sinai. So this makes me wonder what's happening in closed doors, and whether the Qataris are trying to calm the Egyptians down, maybe assure the Israelis by a way or another they're going to be paying money or injecting. So it makes me also think and try to understand what is Qatar is doing with the business tribal leaders that are frustrated because Israel is getting closer to Rafah.
Another bit of conventional wisdom that this calls into question. The Egyptians have said since the beginning of this war, we're not letting any refugees come in, not even women and children, temporarily, even if somebody else pays for it, get out of the war zone, be safe. They have international obligations to do exactly that, and they haven't. And sort of what you've seen in much of the media is, well, yes, but they don't want those Muslim Brotherhood types. Hamas is dangerous. They don't want them there. That's why. But it may not be that at all. If they have been complicit with Hamas, then the more likely explanation is keep the human shields, as many as possible, in Rafah, because that's the best bet you have if you want to stop the Israelis from doing what they feel they need to do in Rafah, close down the tunnels through which the ammunition and weapons are flowing, destroy the last battalions, and defeat Hamas. If Egypt, in other words, is covertly on the side of Hamas, Hamas certainly doesn't want refugees or innocent civilians protected from the war. They want to use them as human shields. In other words, and going back to what you're saying, John, saying the quiet part out loud, this would suggest that Egypt said, yes, let's help Hamas use civilians as human shields, kill civilians, because that can deter Israelis, and that'll turn the international community, so to speak, against Israel from a public relations perspective, as it pretty much has at this point, because Israel will be blamed, not Egypt, not Hamas, for the death of civilians, because that's the way it works. Hamas has been very smart about understanding basic communications theories. Do you agree with that, John? Is that going too far?
And look, it may be going too far. It may not be. I mean, I'm not sure that the Egyptians want to see more slaughter going on here. I think that what they'd like to see is, for Israel to just stop. And my guess is that if I'm reading this right, I think the Egyptians thought they'd be able to get away with this in perpetuity because no one thought that Hamas would be able to pull off what they did on 10/7. And so then all of a sudden, Egypt's caught with its pants down, right? It has no idea how it can stop this other than to just scream about, the potential scuttling of a deal. And that's the situation that they find themselves in. But let me actually add one more wrinkle to all of this. And that is, so I read a fascinating piece. It's a short piece in the Israeli publication Ma'ariv on Tuesday. And that piece quotes a couple of former Israeli intelligence officials who say that Egypt has actually been building up militarily and preparing for a potential confrontation with Israel. In other words, all of its weaponry, all of its training, all of it's designed for one enemy right now. And it's not Libya. It's not Sudan, right? That they really only have one adversary that their army trains for. And that maybe the Israelis and everybody else kind of missed what was going on in that respect, that maybe the Egyptians have been more outwardly hostile to the Israelis than anyone wanted to admit. That I think the Egyptians were very happy to keep taking American money, taxpayer money that was, remuneration for the Camp David Accords, but that they maybe have been preparing for something bigger and messier and uglier. I mean, I think Haisam can probably attest to this, that, the public opinion, I mean, we always hear about how it's a cold peace. Cold doesn't even begin to describe. I mean, when I lived in Cairo, there were two things that I always talk about and this is, of course, ancient history now. This is 2001 when I lived there for a summer, but there was a song on the radio that was wildly popular back then. Some probably will remember it. It was called Ana Bakrah Israel. I hate Israel. And that was like a top song on the radio. It was a top 10 hit. People loved it. And there was another movie that I saw that summer called Itfara Salam, which basically the story was an Egyptian guy inherits money from a wealthy Jewish American woman, and he finds himself in a bind as to whether he takes the money or not because it's a Jewish woman who's pro-Israel. And this is the sort of cultural stuff that we've seen in Egypt brewing for quite a while. Then you look at the tunnels, you look at the potential military buildup. There's a lot here that makes me very uncomfortable. And you're talking to a guy here that has been very supportive of the Egyptians, broadly speaking, that I've been supportive of the Camp David Accords. I've been very nervous about all of the discussion in Congress about defunding Egypt. because it could be destabilizing to the region. But I have to say that right now I'm nervous. I don't like what I'm seeing across the board, and I don't know if there's a good out for Israel here or for the United States. You don't want to scuttle the agreement. You also don't want to let them get away with this. So what are your options if neither one of those look good?
Well, and let's be very specific here. We talk about the U.S. supporting Egypt. If I'm not mistaken, you'll correct me if I am. A lot of that support, I think it's something like $3 billion a year, is specifically for the Egyptian military. So if if Egypt decides it's going to go to war at some level with Israel, it'll be doing so with the backing of U.S. taxpayer dollars. Isn't that right?
Yes, to a certain extent. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about weapons, and training, and right. I mean, and I don't think there's actually a lot of sort of cash that's given to the government. Haisam, you may know this, but you're talking about a lot of money that's been invested. You're talking about F-16s. You're talking about Abrams tanks, and again, what do they need tanks for? Right? What exactly? Where are these tanks going? And it's interesting because the Israelis. I mean, we've heard these stories about how the Israelis went after ISIS and they crossed over the border into Sinai, and that they've actually been operating, in the skies over Egypt with permission of the Egyptian government. And there seems to be some, coordination there. The Israelis have been working with the Egyptians over time. The Egyptians have actually brokered calm in previous rounds of conflict between Israel and Hamas. 2001, they played a significant role. 2014, they played a massive role, actually, in trying to bring about the end of that conflict. But what are they doing militarily? Why do they keep building up that military? Some people say, by the way, that it's just, there's almost a corruption system. They call it wasta, where it's a system where former generals are able to bring in money because they have consulting companies that are part of the acquisition of the U.S. weapons systems. And I've heard that that's just a way of keeping the former military guys happy and financially solvent so that the regime stays stable over time. But this does not appear to me right now to be something that is sustainable in the long term. That there are some real questions that need to be answered, and none of them feel like ones that anyone's going to be happy answering right now.
I just have two thoughts.
Also,
okay.
Yeah, go ahead. You go ahead. Something. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think one of the issues that I felt like the US and Israel over the years didn't discuss it much with Egypt was the production of anti-Semitic TV shows on a yearly basis, and the songs, and making sure the public culture is still prepared that after 50 or 40 years of peace with Israel, a war is going to happen again. I think they should have conditioned some of the military aid that was given to Egypt by a way or another on that, and the Congress should have talked to the Egyptian side and conditioned some money on whether they produce these kind of shows or not, because it shows how irresponsible they are toward teaching the culture of peace in the region inside Egypt and in the Arab world. As I mentioned, based on my personal experience living in Israel, one of the struggles I used to have when I meet the Palestinians there or Arab citizens of Israel, they know the Egyptian culture very well, and they imitate all these anti-Semitic stuff that Egypt teaches because it still has like a soft power culture in the region. So this issue should have been taken seriously in the past by Israel and the US. And actually from now and so on, it should be embraced as a policy as well. What do the Egyptians preach about it? Another thing, and I want to be more positive and optimistic about whether the military really want to get into war or not. Look, one interesting thing after the incident of yesterday, all military pundits inside Egypt who used to cheer for Hamas by a way or another, it changed their position and they became the first and the biggest defender of the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, and even some of them went to Al Jazeera Live and started to confronting Al Jazeera ex-military analysts who are trying to pick on the Camp David Accord. So you have an interest within the Egyptian side. And this also shows me that the Egyptian military is less populist, and the Egyptian military media narrative is less populist in times of crisis compared to its counterparts in the Egyptian foreign ministry and the intelligence apparatus. And the best example is the statements that came from the military spokesperson yesterday. And also another point, Sisi has been getting lots of economic deals from the United Arab Emirates, from Saudi Arabia, the European Union, and the US. So what is the incentive for him, if we are going to consider him a rational leader, to drag his country into a war and stop all of that and destabilize his regime? Because, he's having like 1 million babies being born on yearly basis in the country. Many young people are under the age of 30, unemployed, have nothing to do in the country. So it's for his own interest to actually utilize the current Gaza crisis to collect as much money as he could from the West and Arab Gulf partners in the name of stabilizing his government and making sure he can do double the effort with Gaza reconstructions, blah, blah, blah. And so this makes me assess that they have no interest in getting into war at the time if we're going to think about they are rational people and we want to care about their people and maintaining good socioeconomic status for them.
Another expression of anti-Israelism on the part of Egypt, it seems to me, and a rather glaring one, is that the Egyptian government decided to join the South African government at the International Court of Justice at The Hague in accusing Israel of genocide against the Palestinians. The Egyptians obviously know that is not true. It's a very, very hostile gesture. Again, I understand why the Israelis may not want to, in the midst of a war, respond to that in a very visible and vocal way. But I'm sure that they're taking note of that bit of hostility. That was not necessary for Egypt to do. Now the Intercourt Court, yeah,
it wasn't, Clifford. I mean, I think there are those who might say that Egypt did that because they needed to do something to placate their population, to demonstrate that they were doing something to counter Israel and what's being described as war crimes or what have you by the Egyptian press, and so they needed to do something to kind of back up their words with deeds without engaging militarily. But I do think that this is putting all of these things that we're discussing here, it's putting Israel and Egypt on a collision course of sorts. And I would argue, by the way, that this is not unique, right? We see it also, and Cliff, you and I have discussed this, that Jordan has, I would say, a similar kind of DNA right now, that they're engaging in very hostile rhetoric and in some cases action against the Israeli government. Despite their peace agreements, despite the fact that both countries benefit significantly from the U.S. brokered agreements that give them money and weaponry and other forms of assistance, the Israelis have actually helped both governments fight their extremists from within, and now you see both governments turning around and not even stabbing Israel in the back. I mean, they're stabbing them in the chest. They're not even pretending to hold back here. It's flat out hostility, and I think there will, at some point, there will be a bill that comes due here, and the Israelis are going to have to decide how they want to approach both of these countries. But I'd say that overall, this cannot be a priority, right? The order of battle, right? When you look at Iran and then Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, and the possibility of West Bank or Arab-Israeli conflict, right? These things, this pushes, it relegates the Egypt problem and the Jordan problem to seventh or eighth on the orders of in the sort of order of battle. And so the Israelis have no bandwidth for this whatsoever. What shocks me, though, is the extent to which the U.S. is just not saying a thing. This is malpractice, in my view, that our State Department is not hammering Egypt for doing this kind of thing, right? That, at the end of the day, this is up to the U.S. to try to keep the regional order that we've established. It's on us to hold it together during times of war. And I just don't see anyone's wrist getting slapped here. And by the way, I don't mean that, the U.S. needs to come out and hammer the Egyptians publicly and embarrass them. But man, there should be steps taken either privately or with muted comments from the State Department that says this is not helpful, right? The readouts that I've seen from the State Department don't give any indication of unhappiness on the part of our diplomats in terms of what Egypt's been doing.
And we had believed, the U.S. had, and I think Israel had too, that the Egyptians played a very vital role as honest brokers and negotiators and intermediaries. But on May 21st, CNN reported that Egypt undermined a possible deal to free at least some of the hostages by deliberately miscommunicating Israel's offer to Hamas, or Hamas. It's not quite clear to me, but they weren't being honest about what was being negotiated, what Israel was offering, what Hamas was offering. Do you have any further insight into that incident?
Oh, look, I don't have any direct insight here. What I would just say is this, and Haisam, I'll be curious to hear what you think. I saw those reports, and I'm not particularly shocked given all the other stuff that we've seen now and we've talked about on this program. What actually begins to concern me, though, is that the Israelis are relying on primarily Qatar and Egypt. And the Qataris, we already know, right? They're sponsors of Hamas, and they've been patrons of Hamas, financial and otherwise, for years. And that they've been providing $30 million a month since 2018 to the government, or we call them the government of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And then we also find out that the Egyptians have been allowing these tunnels to operate in roughly that same time period. If you try to kind of extrapolate from that what may have happened, and we all have to be asking ourselves this, was that money essentially going to Egypt to keep those tunnels operating? And if it was, then should the Israelis be dealing with either of these actors right now? Should they be actively working with either Cairo or Doha as brokers? Now, I understand that they were able to broker one agreement thus far, but you can't ignore the fact that this thing has been strung out for months now, where you have these two actors that are purportedly, at least neutral. At least that's what they're trying to sell to the global, community, that they're trying to help. I don't know if they're trying to help. This is what concerns me, is that the Israelis may be playing into their hands and they're actively working with Hamas. And that's a possibility that can't be ignored.
Two other things that occurred to me. One is that, Hassan, you may have some comments on that, and feel free, but maybe roll this in too. The Egyptian officials have been reportedly furious about the humanitarian aid pier the Americans have been trying to build, which hasn't gone all that well either, for two reasons. One is you have boats drifting off to it and ending up beached in Israel and Ashdod. And the other is that, as far as we know, the aid, the food that's offloaded, gets stolen immediately by Hamas. So the aid pier is not working out very well. But they were furious about it, even as they were not letting aid go through Rafah, and with not letting refugees come into the Sinai Desert as well. All of which sounds like they want to exacerbate the situation and make it worse, rather than better. For what purposes, I'm not sure.
I think, to be honest,
any thoughts you have on that?
Yes, since the crisis started on October 7th, Egypt squandered the golden opportunity to show or prove itself as an honest broker or a good mediator between Israel and the Palestinians. So far, their policies have lacked creativity, and they resorted all the time to Mubarak's playbook, or the past, just blame Israel as much as they could, increase the suffering of Palestinians as much as they could, and then market that on the international arena and try to gain some political gains inside the closed doors when it comes to Israel. And they're missing an opportunity, because in the past few years, they were eclipsed by the Turkish and the Qataris' involvement in the Palestinian arena. Nowadays, as Israel is weakening or dismantling Hamas, it's opening a vacuum there and opening the door for Egypt to reestablish itself in modern Middle East politics, after it got diminished in the past 2 decades. But so far, they are squandering the opportunity. And American policymakers should have a tough conversation with Cairo on closed doors and make sure and tell them, don't repeat the mistakes of the 90s that opened the door for Qataris and others that came into the Palestinian arena and diminish your role. If you really aspire to play a bigger role. You have to be as fair as to the Israelis, as fair to the Palestinians. Don't just take sides and exacerbate the situation, especially if it's with a terrorist organization like Hamas that cooperated against the Egyptian government in Sinai territory and tried to harm its national security in the past. And history shows all the details about that.
Let me mention one dog that hasn't barked that it seems to me should have. And that is you've got the Houthi rebels in Yemen, who are yet another proxy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And they have essentially, by attacking merchant commercial shipping in the Red Sea, in the Bab el-Mandab, which is that very strategic strait, they've shut down also much of the shipping that normally goes through the Suez Canal, which is a hugely important source of revenue for Egypt. I would have thought Egypt would be furious at that, but we haven't seen them say that. They haven't talked about that. And that there must be some meaning in that, and I'm not sure what it is, except that it sounds like not only are they in cahoots in some way with Hamas, but also perhaps with Tehran. Is that impossible, John?
Yeah, I mean, look, I do think that it is interesting that we've not seen a condemnation of the Houthis by Egypt. If they have shut down 50% of Suez traffic, and Suez is considered to be, I think, either the number one or number two source of funds for the regime, then it should be a major problem here, massive. And yet, we're not seeing that full-throated condemnation. Now, I will say that the Sunni axis, if you will, the Sunni states that stand on the other side of the Shiite axis, the Iranian axis in the region, they're not exactly profiles in courage, right? I mean, these are not countries that typically come out and challenge the regime or lock horns with the regime. That's not typically what they do. But this is the Houthis at the end of the day. This is a ragtag group of fighters that should not really be a direct threat to Cairo. I mean, I get that maybe Cairo doesn't want some of those long-range missiles that have been fired at a lot. They could probably very easily reach Cairo too, and that's probably the last thing that Egypt wants to have happen. But it would be in their interest, I would think, to come out against this Houthi activity. They've been quiet, and it does raise some weird questions, awkward questions about what's going on in Cairo right now.
And also,
go ahead, Haisam.
yeah. Also, I would add that yes, it seems puzzling because of the economic aspect of the Suez Canal, but actually, the Sisi regime sees that also another opportunity. So he runs to his Gulf partners and he says, "I need money," and they have been handing him because he thinks Egypt is too big to fail, and Gulf countries are scared of the rise of Islamism in the region. So it seems to me that yes, he's losing money, but also he's getting compensated from Arab Gulf partners and even Western capitals. So this could justify or explain a little bit why he hasn't been missing the money that are coming from the Suez Canal by a way or another. Even it seems crazy, but he has been getting lots of free handouts, and he knows he's going to get a lot of that in the upcoming years. So the regime now is at its happiest moment because everybody's trying to give him money. And this could should be utilized as a card against him whenever we discuss his relations with Israel and the involvement in the Palestinian area.
Here's my last thought for today, and then you can respond to it or give any last thoughts you have, and that is that in a way you have to give Hamas and Tehran credit. They understood what an attack that would be terrorist, that would be absolutely barbaric. Somebody might have said to them, you don't want to do it that way. There are other ways to achieve. No, they understood they were going to reshuffle the cards, and it was going to be to their benefit to do what they did on October 7th. And I think so far that's true. I also think that from an Israeli point of view, strategically, the only way to win this is through hard power. There is nothing that's going to happen diplomatically through the U.S., through negotiations, through the UN, through anybody. It's either you defeat Hamas on the battlefield in Rafah, and then turn your attention to the other, and in some ways worse and more dangerous proxy in the north, which is Hezbollah, the Foreign Legion of the Islamic Republic of Iran. If you don't do it through hard power, there is no other way. Nothing else will work. That's what that seems to me the conclusion to all this. But I'll let you have the last words, guys. Haisam, you want to say anything about that?
I missed that the internet was stopped, so I didn't hear the question.
My point is that what Hamas has achieved through terrorism, through brutality, through starting a war that's now lasted close to 8 months, has been considerable, and that there is no deal to be had. There is no soft power solution. There is no diplomatic solution. Either Israel achieves what it needs to achieve militarily, or it loses. I don't think there's any other way for an Israeli to look at it after what we've seen happen all this time.
I definitely agree with you, because if the war stops the next day, and after all this destruction in Gaza, Hamas leaders are going to come out of the tunnels, are going to raise the Palestinian flag, and everybody in Gaza is going to be chanting and declaring win and victory, no matter what. So the only way is that to just keep running after them until you get the last one of them, or at least destroy as many of their leadership, as many of their infrastructures. Otherwise, history is going to continue to repeat itself, and the Egyptian side wouldn't be. I wouldn't trust it after that. So we have to find a way on this side of the border, and Hamas has to be destroyed, and it can be destroyed, and this is going to be good for the Palestinians and not just Israel and the whole Arab world.
I think it is good for the Palestinians as well. Go ahead, John, your final thoughts.
My final thoughts are this, that I think Israel has a lot of work to do on the Rafah crossing. They need to get into the Philadelphia corridor, and they need to stay there. They need to actually create a system that will prevent those tunnels from being used. I do think there's going to be a challenge for Israel to actually go across the border to see what's on the other side. I think they're going to have to be very careful about that. But they can still stop those tunnels from snaking into Gaza, and they need to put something there that is permanent. And to put something there that is permanent will be a challenge. It's going to require some diplomatic dancing on the part of the Israelis and probably the U.S. But I see that as crucial to securing the Gaza Strip. A lot of people are talking about a possible insurgency that may happen as a result of whenever this war ends, whenever Rafah is finally defeated. If you want to stop the insurgency from growing, the way to do that is to secure the borders. And right now, the borders are secure along the border with Israel, right? The northern border and the eastern border, and the maritime border is going to be more secure because the Israelis have deployed their navy there. That last border with Egypt, that small southern border, is the one that I think we need to be watching. If the goal is to create a stable Gaza, it's going to be crucial to shut down whatever smuggling's been happening there. And so I'd say there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. And then I just think there needs to be a revision of whatever the implementation has been up until now of the Camp David Accords. It's clear there's clearly something wrong with the way that it's been implemented. And I don't just mean that it's been a cold peace. I mean that, they're going to have to take a good look at the way that the army is built and the way that it's deployed in Egypt. They're going to have to talk about smuggling. They're going to have to talk about rhetoric. There's a lot of things that we've talked about today that I think cannot go unaddressed when we get on the other side of this conflict. Whenever this crisis is over, these are issues that hopefully will be addressed and fixed.
Yeah, and getting back to where we started, in 1973, there was the Yom Kippur War. Egypt attacked and hoped to wipe out Israel. Israel won that war, took the Sinai, huge resource, gave it back to Egypt, but in exchange for peace. That peace is endangered. As somebody who's been pro-Egypt, and I would say not unsympathetic to Sisi compared to some of our friends, I'm sorry to see Egypt doing what it's doing against Israel, against the future of the Palestinians, and not for the benefit of Egypt as well. Haisam, thanks for this good discussion. John, good to talk to you as always. And thanks to all of you who have been with us for this conversation. here today on Foreign Policy.